May 12th, 2025. No national flags were raised, no historic handshakes, and absolutely no joint press conference streamed live from Geneva. But in a closed room, far from the media spotlight, the US and China suddenly agreed to cool the fiercest tariff war in 5 years. Just weeks earlier, Washington imposed a 145% tariff on nearly all Chinese goods, a rate so high that even the previous administration never reached it. Beijing retaliated with a 125% counter tariff, levying extremely high duties on strategic technology products. And then, abruptly, everything de-escalated. From 145% to 30%, from 125% to 10%, in just 90 days. Financial markets exploded as if the war had ended. But analysts know better. This isn't peace, it's a pause. So the big question is, why did the US choose compromise now? What does China really want? And what's truly happening behind this temporary handshake? Join Top 10 Discoveries Official as we peel back the layers of this deal to understand whether this is a strategic retreat or a silent counterattack waiting for the right moment to strike.
We have reached an agreement on a 90-day pause and substantially moved down the tariff levels. Both sides on the reciprocal tariffs will move their tariffs down 115%.
In a move that caught observers off guard, on May 12, 2025, the US and China unexpectedly announced a temporary trade agreement, marking a rare de-escalation in the tense tariff standoff that has dragged on for months. The centerpiece of the deal is a sharp reduction in tariffs imposed on each other's goods, which had previously pushed global financial markets into severe instability throughout April. The US agreed to lower its average tariff rate from 145% to 30%, applied to nearly all categories of imports from China, including critical sectors like consumer electronics, industrial machinery, steel, and mechanical components. This is the deepest tariff cut since the trade war between the world's two largest economies reignited earlier this year. In response, China reduced its retaliatory tariffs from 125% to just 10%, primarily targeting strategic US goods such as agricultural products, soybeans, beef, corn, medical equipment, and semiconductor technology, sectors that suffered heavily during the recent high tariff phase. The agreement takes effect for 90 days, from May 14th to August 13th, 2025. However, a critical point to note is that there are no binding commitments to extend or move toward a more comprehensive accord. Both sides maintain an open negotiation stance, meaning any possibility of re-escalation or continuation hinges on developments during this 3-month period. Despite significantly reducing tariffs, the US has not fully lifted the trade sanctions imposed on China in recent years. The temporary agreement focuses solely on tariff rates, while strategic strikes, structural and long-term, remain fully intact. First is Section 301 tariffs, which the US invokes to punish alleged intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, and unlawful interference in American corporate property rights. This has been a key legal foundation in the strategy to contain Chinese technology since the US administration. Next is Section 232, applied on national security grounds, allowing the US government to impose heavy tariffs on steel, aluminum, and strategic components to protect the defense industrial supply chain. This section gives Washington a long-term lever in critical industries, even as it eases pressure on the conventional tariff front. Finally, emergency trade measures on synthetic precursors aim to tightly control chemical precursors and pharmaceutical raw materials from China, which is crisis linked to synthetic painkillers ravaging multiple US states. Maintaining these 3 layers of measures shows that tariff reductions come with no political concessions. It's simply a tactical pressure release to calm markets while preserving full authority to reactivate sanctions if trade talks falter. The US, in essence, is opening a temporary relief valve for its own economic system, stabilizing Wall Street sentiment, softening consumer prices, and creating negotiation breathing room with China. but the long-term deterrence tools remain in place, ready to be triggered at any moment if the strategic balance tips toward confrontation. Immediately after the U.S.-China tariff reduction agreement was announced on the evening of May 12th in New York, morning of May 13th in Asia, global financial markets surged as if an imminent threat had been averted. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones soared 1,106 points, marking the strongest session of the year and pushing the market back to a 5-month high. This wasn't just a technical rebound. The rally reflected tangible expectations. U.S. inflation could cool without further monetary tightening, thanks to lower import tariffs. On the Nasdaq, the tech-heavy index climbed 3.2%, led by semiconductor stocks like AMD, Nvidia, and Qualcomm. Investors speculated that if this deal paves the way for even short-term easing of technology export controls, the global chip production value chain could breathe again. Notably, Nvidia, a company impacted by export restrictions to China, saw nearly a 5% gain in a single session. Beyond the U.S., Asian markets also rallied sharply. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index jumped 3.7%, its strongest session since the start of the year. Regional investors welcomed China's proactive tariff cuts as an implicit signal that Beijing aims to create a stable environment to lure foreign capital back. In the energy market, Brent crude oil prices slightly declined from 84.3 to 81.9 per barrel, reflecting expectations that global supply chains, particularly transportation and logistics, will not face significant pressure from trade conflicts in the short term. This price drop also signaled confidence that geopolitical risks in the Taiwan Strait and South China seaports won't escalate for at least a few months. An internal Citigroup report noted, "This isn't a trade peace treaty, but it's an extremely savvy pivot, allowing the U.S. have more conveniences ahead of the midterm elections, while China buys breathing room for its tech manufacturing sector under tight export controls." In other words, markets reacted as if peace had been declared, but those reading the agreement's fine print see it for what it is, a technical ceasefire. According to analyses from the Brookings Institution, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Bloomberg Economics, the U.S.-China tariff reduction deal, though only 90 days long, has the potential to create cyclical shifts in the global economy. Specifically, during this 3-month ceasefire, global GDP growth is expected to rise by about 0.2%, driven by reconnected trade flows and improved investor sentiment. For the U.S., analysts predict exports to China could recover by 15 to 18% if trade momentum remains stable in this short window, particularly for agricultural products, industrial machinery, and medical equipment. At the consumer level, the U.S. Core Consumer Price Index, CPI, could drop by 0.3 to 0.4 percentage points, provided no tariff reversals occur after August 13th. This is critical for the Federal Reserve, Fed, as interest rates are already nearing politically sensitive limits. For businesses, Q2 profits for U.S. tech and agricultural corporations could rise by an average of 5 to 7%, thanks to lower supply chain costs and restored demand from China after months of disruption. A less noticed but significant factor is the possibility of China slightly increasing investments in U.S. Treasury bonds, as a measure to support bilateral financial market stability, especially if Beijing seeks to maintain foreign exchange liquidity without devaluing the renminbi. Wall Street analysts bluntly dubbed this deal a trade circuit breaker, a temporary cutoff switch for the trade war. There are no commitments to long-term peace, no binding legal framework, and no new dispute resolution mechanisms. But it's still critical because it halts a collapse in investor confidence at its peak just before Q2 earnings reports. For the U.S., the deal reopens agricultural export channels to China, a lifeline for the Midwest economy and a key voter seat for the 2026 midterms. For China, it's a chance to clear tech inventory backlogs, stalled by U.S. and European chip bans. But this agreement isn't automatic. It's a conditional pause, where both sides are watching market reactions, domestic inflation, and long-term strategic calculations. If either side unilaterally reinstates high tariffs after August 13th, the current state of stability could reverse in less than 48 hours. A pause, but no disarmament. That's the true nature of this game. On the surface, the temporary US-China agreement appears to be the result of good faith negotiations, but in reality, it's a mutually necessary pause. And what's more telling, each side stepped back for different reasons. Under current administration, the shock and negotiate tactic proved effective in past trade talks. However, the 2025 context has shifted. Inflation remains a haunting specter in the US, especially as consumer prices rose again after a brief Q1 adjustment. Maintaining 145% tariffs on China is driving up costs for imported raw materials, components, and basic consumer goods, directly pressuring the Fed and monetary policy. Wall Street is concerned, with the S&P 500 dropping nearly 8% in April before the agreement, pushing many tech firms into dangerous valuation territory. And above all, the 2026 midterm elections loom, meaning the U.S. leader needs a political calm to consolidate domestic support, rather than a protracted trade war that could alienate Midwest farmers. The 90-day deal allows the U.S. to cool domestic prices, restore market confidence, and create a flexible time frame for deeper strategic calculations, without losing face. Meanwhile, Beijing entered the talks with its own undeniable domestic pressures. China's economy is grappling with a dual crisis of a stagnant property sector and weak consumption. The 125% U.S. tariffs made it hard for China to offload tech inventory, particularly items like smartphones, electronics, and new energy batteries, which form a massive share of its exports. Urban youth unemployment surpassed 20%, according to early May data, placing immense strain on social welfare systems and political credibility. The renminbi faces devaluation risks, forcing the People's Bank of China to inject liquidity, while still needing U.S. dollars for energy, raw material imports, and domestic credit system stability. In this context, a 90-day window not only allows China to ramp up exports again, but also gives the government time to address domestic issues before facing new trade policy adjustments, if they return. What's fascinating is that neither the US nor China de-escalated because they resolved their conflicts, but because both needed to delay confrontation to address internal challenges. The US needs to keep consumer prices in check without being forced to raise interest rates further. China needs to push goods to global markets to sustain growth and political stability, and Geneva, with its neutrality and discreet setting, became the ideal venue for both to pause their confrontation while keeping hands on the hilt. This isn't peace, it's time for each side to tend to economic strains before deciding whether to resume strategic confrontation or shift tactics. There's something peculiar about the US-China trade agreement on May 12, 2025. No press conference, no handshakes, not a single live stream released to the public. And in that silence, the true nature of the meeting becomes clear. This wasn't a political victory needing loud fanfare, but a covert test between two superpowers probing paths in the gray zone of geopolitics. For the first time under the current U.S. administration, two senior finance and economic figures, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng, sat face-to-face at the negotiating table. Neither are camera-friendly figures. They are technocrats, chosen precisely for that reason, to negotiate technically, not perform diplomatic theater. The goal wasn't to create a historic moment like G20 Osaka 2019, but to re-establish a pragmatic dialogue channel, discreet enough to adjust if needed, legitimate enough to avoid appearing as capitulation. The absence of a joint press conference or live stream wasn't due to mistrust. It was deliberate strategy. Both sides knew that if US or Chinese media hyped this event, it would spark backlash from their domestic bases. For the US, any image suggesting US shaking hands with Beijing would immediately draw criticism from hawks as a weakness toward China, especially after he just erected a 145% tariff wall. For China, over-publicizing a deal with the US could damage the hardline confrontation image Beijing maintains on domestic channels. Silence in this case wasn't evasion, it was to prevent disruption. Another notable point is that both sides agreed to establish a long-term trade consultation mechanism in Geneva. This marks a significant shift in the structure of bilateral dialogue. Previously, Geneva was where the US and China traded hardline statements or objections at the WTO, such as when Beijing protested chip bans or the US sued China over industrial subsidies. Now, Geneva could become a hub for coordinating bilateral trade traffic, hosting technical dialogues, tariff rate negotiations, and monitoring non-tariff conditions. No longer just a trade courtroom, Geneva is being recast as a soft policy control room, where the US and China can adjust directions without sparking public conflict. Very few knew the details of this negotiation before the announcement. No major leaks, no exclusive scoops, and no market accurately predicted this reaction. That's because the Geneva talks were structured like a political sandbox, a space where both sides could test policies without being bound by public pressure or immediate media reactions. In an era where every negotiation is live-streamed, the absence of cameras signals the seriousness and risk of the decision. When the US and China quietly slashed tariffs, many immediately compared the move to historic, temporary truce moments, like the 1973 Paris Peace Accords ending US involvement in Vietnam, or the 2019 G20 trade ceasefire in Osaka. But Geneva 2025 is distinct in essence, and dangerous in its structure. In some ways, the Geneva Agreement echoes the 1973 Paris Accords, which directly halted US combat in Vietnam. Both followed prolonged tensions where neither side achieved clear victory. Instead of escalating further, they chose conditional withdrawal, ceding space to restructure internally and manage losses. For the US, it's stabilizing inflation and securing strategic supply chains. For China, it's restoring exports, reducing unemployment, and clearing inventory backlogs. Like Paris, Geneva lacks fanfare, isn't permanently binding, and, crucially, doesn't resolve root issues. If Paris left unresolved the political system of South Vietnam and post-war strategy, Geneva leaves untouched core conflicts over technology, state subsidies, and strategic supply chain control. Meanwhile, compared to G20 Osaka 2019, where President Trump and Chairman Xi stepped onto the global stage, jointly declaring a temporary trade truce, Geneva 2025 is almost the complete opposite. Osaka was a media moment, designed to signal to the world, calm markets, and elevate the stature of both leaders. In contrast, Geneva is a technical memo drafted in silence. No cameras, no press, no iconic imagery. If Osaka was an invitation for the world to watch a power play, Geneva sends a message to just two audiences: financial markets and high-level policymakers. And the absence of media underscores the seriousness and risk of this agreement. Unlike treaties aimed at ending wars, Geneva carries no expectation of lasting peace. No language in the press release mentions ending the trade war. No roadmap for commitment. No binding oversight mechanism. The Geneva Agreement is, in essence, a temporary stabilization tool, a political and economic firebreak, activated when both sides realize further escalation would harm more than pressure. The U.S. needs to ease consumer price, CPI, pressures to avoid forcing the FED to hike rates further, a move that could derail growth and slow re-election momentum. China needs to unclog export supply chains, particularly tech products, stalled by chip bans and non-tariff barriers. While G20 Osaka was a camera moment for global virality, Geneva is an internal mechanism, a sealed control room where both sides enter, lock the door, and conduct discreet negotiations. No flashing lights, no peace declarations, just a pause and tools still in place. On the surface, the Geneva 2025 agreement looks like a positive turning point. Tariffs slashed, markets rebounding, tensions easing. But in essence, it's not a structural shift in US-China relations. It's a calculated tactical move to delay conflict, not end it. Analysts have proposed several theories about this deal. Theory 1, pausing the war to dodge a shock before 2026 elections. For the US, the short-term motive is clear: averting an economic challenge before the 2026 midterms. With U.S. consumer prices rising again and unemployment ticking up, maintaining 145% tariffs on Chinese goods equates to a price race the Fed can't control with interest rates. Each rate hike is a blow to the middle class, where votes are wavering. Thus, the Geneva deal acts as a political relief valve, letting the White House maintain short-term economic stability without altering long-term strategy, its tactical flexibility to hold geopolitical ground. Theory 2, testing a soft ceasefire model. From both sides, Geneva could be a deliberate test, a conditional ceasefire in 90-day cycles to gauge trade recovery in domestic political reactions. Instead of betting on a comprehensive deal unlikely in uncertain times, both sides create a flexible cycle, like a diplomatic sandbox. Partially cut tariffs, monitor market reactions, adjust if needed. If markets respond positively, extend. If domestic political backlash arises, reverse without being accused of betraying commitments. If the other side violates the spirit of the deal, reinstate high tariffs without legal constraints. This maintains leverage without openly waging war, a tactic suited to volatile geopolitics and scarce strategic trust. However, even with tariffs reduced to 30% and China's retaliatory tariffs at 10%, the strategic core of the conflict remains untouched. The U.S. retains a 10% surcharge under Section 301, a trade warning shot, enough to keep China cautious without sparking backlash from U.S. businesses. Export bans on advanced technology, especially AI chips, chip design tools, and EUV lithography systems, continue to restrict China's access, forcing Beijing to allow limited trade while still facing growth constraints. In other words, tariffs may drop, but the control axis remains. This isn't a real concession, but a pressure release to maintain control longer. And digging deeper, the Geneva Agreement feels like a strategic constraint, not choking the opponent but tight enough to keep them in bounds. A strategic constraint to test reactions, not a release for peace. The Geneva Agreement lasts 90 days, a period just long enough to impact financial markets but not enough to reshape economic power structures. And that raises the big question: what happens after August 13th, 2025, when the tariff cuts expire? Analysts have outlined three main scenarios. Each is plausible, and each choice will reveal who's truly steering the game. Scenario 1, extend the agreement, but no long-term commitment. This is the scenario Wall Street investors hope for most. If the first 90 days yield positive signals, export growth, controlled inflation, stable markets, both sides could quietly extend for another 90 days. No press conference, no binding document, just a simple Treasury statement. Both sides agree to maintain current tariff levels while continuing consultations. That's enough to keep markets calm through 2025. This is ideal for governments needing time without appearing politically weak. Scenario 2, conditional extension. Open for reassessment. In this scenario, the U.S. might maintain the 30% tariff, but attach new conditions. China must further open its financial markets, commit to not dumping low-end chips, comply with AI and semiconductor supply chain audits. Similarly, China might demand the U.S. ease bans on non-military grade chips or allow U.S. firms to sell industrial software to the mainland. This is a Lego-style negotiation model, piecing together small conditions to extend the ceasefire while preserving strategic positions. Scenario 3, reignite conflict deliberately. If one side feels exploited or markets don't respond as expected, or a political event disrupts, e.g., developments in Taiwan, the South China Sea, or chip conflicts, tariffs could be reinstated within 24 hours. The U.S. returns to 145%. China retaliates with 125% or imposes import quotas. Markets reverse, supply chains unravel, and a new pressure cycle begins, this time with less restraint. In this scenario, Geneva isn't a peace treaty, but a breather between rounds. The key takeaway for audiences is that the Geneva Agreement isn't designed to last forever. It's a strategic device, allowing each side to reassess, reprioritize, and prepare for the next move. And that next move won't unfold at a conference table, but in markets, corporate boardrooms, and voter sentiment from the Midwest to Asia's tech hubs. Geneva 2025 isn't a pivotal redefinition of U.S.-China relations. It's not a peace treaty, nor is it strategic remorse. It's a calculated maneuver, cold, quiet, and full of strategic undertone. In a world where trade conflicts can ignite global financial crises with a few tweets, the Geneva Agreement is a technical breath, preventing both sides from suffocating in the tension they created. But with tariffs only temporarily lowered, tech bans intact, and no long-term commitments signed, this isn't reconciliation. It's a contract to temporarily hold power. A soft ceasefire model being tested, a stage set up just to hear where the political echoes resound. What do you think of the short-term Geneva-style negotiation strategy? Is it a step forward or just a way to delay a crisis? Share your perspective in the comments. We deeply value diverse viewpoints as they help us understand the world more clearly. Drop your thoughts in the comment section. We read every response. And if you want to keep following the sharpest global, geopolitical, trade, and tech analyses, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Join Top 10 Discoveries Official to uncover the next moves, where trade isn't just goods, but a lever of power.